everyone. My name is Frida Weisel, and I'm a New York City, Brooklyn-based Jewish YouTuber with an interest in all things Jewish, subcultures, religion, New York City, and human interest stories. Passover is an intense, rich Jewish holiday that I haven't even begun scratching the surface on in my work. One of the most famous, biggest pieces of Passover is the seder, the long, endless meal where Jews celebrate the story of being freed from slavery in Egypt. We do it by reading from a book called a Haggadah. This is a book with a series of rituals and readings. The word seder means order, and it's rituals of and reading of eating, doing things, and telling stories. And today I want to go through it. I want to go through the Haggadah with a particular nerdy twist. My fellow Jewish YouTuber, David Ackerman from the channel Yiddishkeit, has been knee-deep into exploring the story of the Haggadah for his channel. David is now a return guest to my program. I've talked to him before about Jewish movies. That was a really enjoyable conversation. For this Passover, he is completing a 3-year movie project documenting various Haggadahs and their rich illustrations. We're going to go through the Seder in order, the Seder in the Haggadah, also in abbreviation, because we're trying to keep this to an hour. So we're not going to be here all night. We're going to be looking at different Haggadah pages with different illustrations and their stories. And along the way, we can focus on how these tell different stories and similar stories. I, having grown up Hasidic, I'm eager to see how different Jews have told these stories. Just a little note, there's a tradition on Passover to ask for an afikomen, a small gift. I want to ask you, the viewers, for a small afikomen. If you're able to support my work by being a channel member, that would mean so much. I'm trying to build up a channel membership because it's very hard to support this work without sponsors, and members are becoming the primary way I cover costs of production. So thank you for the afikomen. I'd give you a piece of handmade shmur matzah as thanks if I could. But in the interim, a happy Passover. Hi, David. How are you?
Hey, Frida. It's good to be here.
Are you very busy for Passover?
I'm really just crunching, trying to finish this film. This is going to be the third Passover I'm attempting to release this beforehand. So
Wow. It's like a pre-Passover craziness for you. I've gotten the sense in our pre-production conversations that it's like cleaning your house for Passover the way you're cleaning up this edit.
in a way, like a lot of people tend to obsess about cleaning the house perfectly, etc. For me, the obsession is very much about the edit.
Yeah, I love how passionate you are about the stories of the Haggadahs. The first video I watched of yours about the Haggadah actually was the emoji Haggadah, which on first glance is like, oh, it's just a book of emojis. But it's actually the way you break it down, and you've used visual aids in a very helpful way. It shows how we can communicate instead of through language, through images. And that is so interesting.
Well, the emoji Haggadah is definitely a very unique version of the Haggadah because it's written only with emojis, and there's a lot of different ways the author, Martin Bodek, actually translated from English into emoji. We could get into that more if you want, but yeah, like you said, the Haggadah is a very unique book because there's a lot of Jewish writing. You know, Jews are often called the people of the book because of the Torah and the Talmud and prayer books, and there's basically no end to the amount of Jewish books out there. But the Haggadah is the only one that's not only illustrated, but consistently throughout hundreds of years. And that's very rare. Like sometimes you'll find, like a prayer book from 13th century Germany that has a picture in it or something, or like an illustrated Megillah scroll from the Enlightenment era, whatever. But they're very rare. They're very unique. They're kind of one of a kind. But Haggadahs, on the other hand, there's almost like a tradition that goes from century to century, from place to place. And the Haggadahs that we have today, like the illustrated Haggadahs I grew up with, are also part of that tradition of not just having the book, but having it illustrated in beautiful colors.
Yeah, like to the point that there are Haggadahs in museums that, yeah.
Exactly.
I really love your passion around that. And I actually didn't realize that the Haggadah is the book that like has exemplified illustrations as a mode of preserving story and transmitting story.
In fact, the first Jewish illustrated manuscript to ever be studied was a Haggadah in the 1890s. And yeah, there's a whole fascinating story behind that. But to your point, the Haggadah is kind of the icon of historic Jewish illustration.
The book that you use to follow the Seder, to do the whole long Seder, is the Haggadah, obviously. Until when did your family usually do the Seder? It's a competition.
Oh my goodness. That was the one question I was not anticipating. Every year we say we're going to eat avokaimen before Chadzais, but that has yet to happen. I don't know. Usually around like 2:30 is the norm. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't take that long to actually read the Haggadah through, but it never takes an hour. It always takes the whole night.
Yeah, I don't know why it takes so long. Well, you're eating and okay, let's do it. Let's start our Seder, our bookish version of the Seder. Where do we begin?
I guess we would take a step back before we even jump into like the Seder itself and just explain briefly what all of this is all about. So in the Bible, we have the story of the Exodus, Yetzias Mitzrayim, and this holiday commemorates that event, which is the Israelites leaving Egypt and going into the desert, receiving the Torah, and eventually into the Promised Land. And so the meal is very symbolic. It has symbolic foods. There's a lot of singing. There's prayers. And of course, there's the actual retelling of this story in great detail. Haggadah opens usually with a ritual of searching the house for chametz, which is leavened product, where you're supposed to get rid of that. And then it jumps into the steps of the meal. The steps include Kadesh, which is a blessing on wine, which sanctifies the holiday. It's kind of like the opening. It sets the tone for what everything that comes next. Then you have a couple of important symbolic rituals. So they're called orchatz, which is the washing of the hands, which is for ritual purity, not, like with soap, but like with a cup. There's the dipping of vegetables. There's like a bunch of different versions of this, potatoes, parsley, and so on. I'm curious, what does your family use?
We actually didn't use potatoes. We only used radishes. Have you heard of that?
Yeah.
So for Passover, my family was extra stringent. So we only used unwashed vegetables. They were in the soil. If you go to Williamsburg, you'll see they sell these. They're in the soil. So imagine peeling radishes that are like still in the soil. It was actually a job. And so we didn't have so many. I think I'm telling it correctly. If my memory is off, I'm just humiliating myself, and that's fine. But we would dip the radish in salt water, and there weren't so many, so it was really delicious. And we were starving. The Seder starts after a full day where you're scrunching to finish everything, and then you nap and you put on your new clothing. Did you put on new clothing Passover night? You dressed up in new clothing.
You dress up, yeah.
Yeah, I put on this shirt because I felt like it's appropriate for like the vibe. Velour would be in the winter, but kind of like that. This is the vibe of the clothing. And you're like so hungry after all the prayers, and finally you have this little bit of grape juice and that little bit of radish. But we never had potatoes. I would have loved potatoes.
It's always like you're not supposed to eat a lot of it. So, but everyone ends up eating a ton of potatoes, and it's like, no, you can't eat it.
My family actually has an interesting ritual that you put walnuts on the table, and you can crack them and eat them before, because there's so many rituals in the Haggadah until you get to the eating part that the children need to be distracted. So there's a tradition of keeping uncracked walnuts, and you can crack it. And walnuts, I don't know, have you ever cracked a walnut, eaten an uncracked walnut? Okay, they actually are a little difficult to eat because they're like wrapped up in little pieces. So you kind of have to like think of a pomegranate, like similar thing. So we'd spend our time after Karpas, the macho ones would crack the walnut in their palm. The rest of us would do it in the like nisselkrache, the nutcracker way. But then we would get to eat a little bit of that. But you're not supposed to fill up at all, just little nibbles.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I heard about that ritual of having nuts at the Seder, but no, we personally don't have that. There's like the classic, I don't know what to call it. It's like the classic joke that everyone is kind of obligated to make, which is, oh, the Seder is so long. Like, okay, we get it. It's like mother-in-law jokes. Like, we get it. but it's kind of an obligation, So, but that's where it comes from, the fact that the meal is strategically placed towards the end of this entire ceremony in order to basically make sure that you're there for everything beforehand to build up to the meal. Because once you eat, everybody's kind of passing out. But leading up to that, we have the big stretch, which is the retelling of the story of the Exodus, which is the main portion of the Haggadah, together with all these different rituals and even like side rituals, like you said, with having nuts and keeping the children engaged.
A big part of the Haggadah is a list of this seder: Kadesh, Irchatz, Karpas, Yachatz. Yachatz is when you break the matzah, and then Magid is the telling of the story. So there's Kadesh, Irchatz, Karpas, Yachatz, which are minor rituals, and then the meat of it is Magid, which I'm sure we're going to talk about in a minute. And then afterwards, later, comes the actual meal. But like every child knows to sing Kadesh, Orchatz, Karpas, and knows the order of it. But the Haggadah, I believe, also documents the order, right, of the night. I remember there'd be like a first page with all of it in summary. Can you talk about how these are documented and maybe show it to me?
Yeah, sure. What's very interesting is that the list has always been there, often just written in a couple of lines, like not even as a column, but just one word after the other. And these are pretty common. A lot of Haggadahs that we have today have kind of a grid of steps and show us different pictures. One example would be from the Art Scroll Children's Haggadah, which looks something like this. You could see the different steps that we've been talking about. But what's interesting about this is that the first Haggadah to ever have this was the Venice Haggadah from 1609. This is just one of the steps from this Haggadah from 400 years ago. You could see the step of eating the matzah, and you could see the father on the left holding it up and the other members of the seder sitting there waiting anxiously to eat a little bit of that cracker. Also, what's notable is that they're all wearing the clothing of Italy in the 1600s. So I guess take a step back. There's really three ages that the Haggadahs were created in. The first is manuscripts, which means made by hand. And those are all unique. There's only one of each of those Haggadahs. Then there's the printing age, where they would have metal letters and often woodcut illustrations. So this is an example of that. The letters here are all made out of metal, but the pictures were carved into wood.
And then stamped.
They were formatted as part of the page, and then ink rolled over the whole thing, and then exactly stamped onto the paper, and then eventually bound into a book. But what this means is that you're able to have many editions of the same Haggadah, and that way it can spread much more around the world. So once we get into the printing age, you really have, I don't know about the word viral, but I guess influential Haggadahs. So the Venice is one of them that's very influential in the 1600s. And then comes another one, the Amsterdam Haggadah, which is from 1695, the first edition. And that becomes super influential in the 17 and 1800s, even all the way to like early Maxwell House Haggadahs. The Amsterdam Haggadah also preserved the grid of showing us all the different steps of the Seder. And many Haggadahs today will have a similar grid that shows us all the different steps, except in the Venice, they're dressed like people in Italy in the 1600s. and Amsterdam, they look very distinctly like they're from the Netherlands in the late 1600s, 1700s. And then you get to, let's say, the Art Scroll Children, they look like people from the 20th century. So again, we could see how each generation also preserves the way they look. And again, they're all, like you mentioned before, they're all dressed up in honor of this big meal.
So what else do we have? Of Kadesh, Irchatz, Karpas, and Yachatz, is there any interesting illustrations before we get to the telling of the story of the Haggadah?
Those are really the symbols, the icons of the Seder, and that you'll see in a lot of Haggadahs preserved. So the wine, the matzah, and the horseradish, and kind of as a side character is also the vegetables that's dipped into salt water called karpas. But the first three are really the icons because of what they represent. So the matzah represents this duality, I guess, of oppression and redemption. The oppression is that the matzah was eaten by the slaves. It's a very basic form of sustenance, just flour and water baked into a cracker. And then you also have maror, which is bitter herbs. Our family uses horseradish, People also use other types of bitter herbs. You could use wasabi or something to give you that sense of like something that's spicy or bitter. And it represents the bitterness of enslavement. And then the wine represents the idea of redemption, being freed. And it's supposed to symbolize royalty and how like we've come from the lowest of lows to the highest of heights. And so that's why they're very symbolic. And you could see that represented throughout history. One of my favorites is the Washington Haggadah, with a man pouring wine into a goblet. And this is next to the area. You can see on the side, it says Manishtana Halayla Hazeh. And the reason why it's next to Manishtana is because at this point, you finish drinking the first cup of wine, which is Kiddush, the opening sanctification. And now you're getting to the second cup, which is there for the entire duration of the story of the Exodus. We do little rituals with it. You pour a little bit of it out at certain moments and you raise it at certain moments and things like that. So this picture, the artist drew a man pouring up a cup at the point where you're supposed to fill up your cup.
Out of the 4 cups, we should say. There are a total of 4 cups for the night.
Yeah, there's 4 cups. Again, it also symbolizes the idea of redemption because there's 4 Lashonis of Gula. There's 4 expressions of redemption that are mentioned in the passage in Exodus. And so, again, it becomes highly symbolized that there's a lot of 4 in the Haggadah. There's 4 cups, there's 4 suns, 4 questions, and so on.
I didn't realize. So let's talk about Magid. By the way, to digress for a second, you know, in the Hasidic community, the rituals are performed with the children reciting for each siman in Yiddish, like a couple of lines of instruction. So, for instance, Kaddish, which is the first one, the blessing of the wine, sanctifying the night. You say Kaddish, wenn der Tate kommt daheim von Schiel, tite sich der Wasser, Kittel, und macht schnell Kiddush, da die kleine Kinder sollen nicht anstopfen. And it means Kaddish, when dad comes home from shul, he puts on the white Kittel. He blesses the wine quickly so the young children don't fall asleep. I mean, does anyone actually do that? Do they really think of the young children not falling asleep and rush through the night? No, it's dragged out and everyone's sleeping by the end, or the children are sleeping by the end. But the lines we all knew how to say from a young age by heart. Did you have anything comparable to that? It's like the instructions are recited like a chant?
Not really. We sang the song of the steps, like Kadesh Urchatz Karbas, and pretty much jumped right into it. But what I will say is interesting is that many Haggadahs, especially the middle section, the printed Haggadahs from, let's say, the 1400s to the 1900s, they started to have explanations about what should happen during the seder in the local languages. And so one of those languages, obviously Yiddish, would also have those type of instructions. My Yiddish is not great. I don't really speak Yiddish or can read it. But other Haggadahs, like I'm thinking right now of the Prague Haggadah, I believe, or other such Haggadahs, they have this instruction as kind of part of the Haggadah. So it opens and it shows a man with a candle searching his home for chametz, for leavened product. And it says next to it that on the 14th of Nisan, you have to check your home. And then underneath it, it says, you know, kishemachnisim beis hakneses, like when you come home from synagogue, you should, along the lines of what you're saying, that exactly like start the meal process by making Kiddush, the blessing on wine.
And it's in Hebrew.
I remember it because it's in Hebrew, because I can actually read and understand.
I see. Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. Because now that we're talking about Haggadahs, I believe the Haggadahs of my childhood were very heavy on instruction in Yiddish. And what's interesting is I didn't learn Hebrew. Unlike you, we didn't learn Hebrew. And so almost always when we're davening, when we're looking at books, I wouldn't understand them. Like Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, we would be sitting hours and hours over books and I wouldn't understand them. The Haggadah is an absolute exception in that regard because it was very Yiddish heavy. We could read it and there was a lot of instructions, including the things I recited, the chants.
That is very interesting. And you could definitely see that throughout history. There's a Haggadah from Venice in the mid-1600s. I forget exactly what year it's from. And it has the steps of the Seder written in 3 columns. So on the top line is just all the steps, Kadesh Orchatz, till the end, till Nirtza. And then there's 3 columns written in 3 different languages explained to the reader. And it was made for the Venice ghetto. And what's really interesting about that is the ghetto was an area in Venice, was actually the first one of its kind in Europe. And Jews were only allowed to live in this area. And you have refugees from across Europe, from Spain, from Germany, from Eastern Europe, and then native Italian Jews. And they're all living together, but they don't speak the same language. The only language they have in common is classical biblical Hebrew. And so the Haggadah has these 3 columns. The first one is called Lashon Laz, which just means the local language, which is Italian. And the second one is called Lashon Sfard, which is Spanish or Ladino. And then the third column is Lashon Ashkenaz, which means German, also known as Yiddish. And the thing is that they're all written in Hebrew characters. So it appears as if it's Hebrew, but they're all different languages. So I can only read the Hebrew part of it, like the part that says Kadesh. But what it actually says after it, I don't know. I guess you'd have to take a look at it.
Yeah,
and say,
that's so
you can actually read it.
Let's dive into Magid. What happens at Magid?
Magid comes from the same word as Haggadah, which means to tell. And this is really where we dive into the story of the Exodus. The key part of the story is about how Jacob descends into Egypt with his family. They get enslaved there for hundreds of years. Their lives are embittered as they're enslaved, and then God redeems them, brings the 10 plagues. There's the moment where they leave the Exodus, and then the Red Sea is split. They go through it, and then that's kind of where the story ends in the Haggadah. And then loosely, we have they arrive to the promised land at some point in the future, and they live happily ever after. That's kind of the framing of the story. But there's more to it than Magid. That's kind of like the heart of Magid. That's the center. But leading up to it, you also have other rituals in order to engage the young ones, the children. And particularly, you have the 4 questions, which is basically noticing. It's very formulaic because you're supposed to say it a certain way, but it's noticing how there's a lot of things that are strange about this meal that we just went through, explaining how we're dipping vegetables into salt water, how we're eating flatbread, and we had to spend weeks and weeks cleaning our house and getting rid of bread, and for some people for beans, and covering everything in foil. Like, what's going on with that? And just noticing all of these strange things. And this is built into the Haggadah as a way to build intrigue with our audience, the family, particularly the young ones. And exactly. And a lot of this has to do with the intergenerational aspect of the Haggadah, which is also a big theme. And the simple meaning is that the father or the head of the household tells the children about the story the way that his father told him, and so on, all the way back to the original event. But also there's the element that the oppression of Egypt also repeats itself in every generation, but the redemption of Egypt also happens in every generation. So even though we might be facing problems and we kind of arrive at the Seder with all the problems of our day, the message is that nonetheless, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. There's something beyond the horizon that will be better. And this is culminated in the phrase of this year we're here, next year we'll be in Jerusalem, or this year we're slaves, next year we'll be free. This idea, not just applying to the story of the Exodus itself, but also to every generation, us included. And that's also the message of Magid as well.
So how is that told? Like, can you show us different interesting images?
I would love to.
Haggadah. Yeah, oh, okay, please.
There's 2 Haggadahs that I grew up with that kind of represent what modern Haggadahs mean to me personally. And they really capture a lot of this. So first one is the Cat's Haggadah. It has these beautiful illustrations. And the first one I'm showing is of the enslavement in Egypt. This is a visual that often comes up of enslavement, of crying out to God. And the image that's paired with that is the Exodus from Egypt, the moment where they leave. And this Haggadah, it is beautiful, made by Gadi Pollack, the illustrations, and yeah, just it really brings it to life. I remember as a kid, like feeling like I'm falling into these images, could stare at it for hours. And this one I used when I was a little bit younger, called the Art Scroll Children's Haggadah, illustrated by Tova Katz. And again, you could see the images from the Exodus story itself. Here showing the Egyptians drowning in the Red Sea while the Israelites are crossing. We also see the rituals of the seder as well. So here is them searching and burning the leavened bread, but you also see people sitting at the seder, doing all the rituals you spoke about.
Oh, here are the simanim.
Exactly. It has the icons of the goblet of wine, the icons of the matzah and the bitter herbs, and so on. So these really capture the elements of the seder, but they come up in a lot of other Haggadahs. So this Haggadah is called the Sarajevo Haggadah, named after the city where it's located today, and it's belonged to Sarajevo for the past 130 years or so. So it was made in Spain in the 1300s, and what's unique about it is that the text of the Haggadah is illuminated. It has some interesting pictures next to it, but not really illustrated. Inside the Haggadah, it has something called a biblical cycle, which is a section in front of the Haggadah that is just illustration. It's kind of like a medieval comic strip in a sense, where it's just frames on each page that show us illustrations of biblical stories. So the Haggadah focuses very narrowly on the Exodus proper, but the Sarajevo Haggadah shows us the entire narrative, starting all the way from creation, which you can see over here. All the way on the right, we have the Spirit of God floating on the water. We have day and night, and so on, all the way till we have trees, animals, and so on. And then you could see an image all the way on the left of a man resting on Sabbath, on Shabbos. And again, he's dressed in the style of Jews in the 1300s in Spain. So again, it's capturing that moment in time.
Looks like a woman to me.
Because of the head covering, yeah. Similarly, in this image of Moses and Aaron on the right here and Pharaoh on the left.
Incredible.
Moses and Aaron also have their heads covered in a similar fashion.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
And
maybe that was the clothing of the time. The men covered their heads.
Exactly. Yeah, this was how Jewish men in Spain would dress and cover their heads. You can see Pharaoh on the left does not look like what we think of as Pharaoh. He looks very much like a Spanish king in the 1300s, because the idea of illustrating the Exodus story like it would have looked based on archaeology is a very recent innovation. Basically, once archaeology became very mainstream in the early 1900s, like with the finding of King Tut and things like that. But before then, it was always illustrated based on how it looked then. But this illustration of Moses and Aaron with Pharaoh is, again, the Exodus story where they come to confront him, tell him, let my people go. And then this image also is of the Exodus. Again, you could see the head coverings. And they're leaving Egypt, which looks like a castle.
With swords.
Yes.
The person in the green toga in the back is what?
I'm not sure exactly what character it is. It's probably just like a generic Egyptian saying, you know, good riddance, get out of here. We had enough of your plagues.
I see.
Be off with you.
I see.
But you pointed out the sword, and I'll point out a few other details. So Spanish Haggadahs in particular really liked to do a very literal take on the words of the story of the Exodus. So there's a few details. You mentioned the swords. There's also dough on the shoulders that they're holding, little round pieces of dough. And also you'll notice that their hands are raised in the air. And this has to do with a few elements of the Exodus story. So the first is that the reason why we eat matzah, we mentioned, is two reasons. The redemptive element is that they had to leave so fast that they didn't have a chance for the dough to rise. And so we eat flat bread instead. So that's what that element represents. The swords represents the word in the pasuk that says that they left chamushim, which could be translated as armed. And then the hands in the air is because the verse says, Ubnei Yisrael yaitzim biyad rama, which means they left with an upper hand. Now, usually that means that they left on a high, they were triumphant, you know, they were the winners in this story. But the artist takes it literally and says, no, they went out with an upper hand, like their hand was raised in the air.
Wow.
And again, it's symbolizing the redemption, but it's very literal in how it does it.
These are not woodcuts, right? Are they? No.
This is manuscript, which means hand-drawn. So it's made on parchment.
Woodcuts are always going to be one color?
Woodcuts, which come later during the printing age, would be one color because of they'll be printed in black. But then a lot of times they would be given to an artist who would then hand paint the details back in. And that was still very popular up until we get color printing in the modern era. So you'll have many editions of the illustration, but variations on how they were colored.
Oh, interesting. So this is a manuscript.
Yeah, this is a manuscript from Spain, which means it's a one of one. This one's called the Golden Haggadah. So I was just showing you images from the Sarajevo. This is golden. It's called golden because of the gold leaf on the background of all these illustrations. Here's another one. You see all the gold on the background. But again, you see how they're going out. They're all holding little pieces of dough, and they all have their hands raised in the air. And this time you could see Pharaoh with his crown in the background being like, get out of here.
Or come back, no?
Initially tells them to get out of here, but then
He starts to chase them.
he chases after them, exactly. This Haggadah is also from the same time period, 1300s, from Germany. And you could see Moses all the way on the left, leading them out, and you could see them holding little pieces of dough, which are then on their shoulders.
Why are they birds?
Very good question. I was waiting for you to ask that. So this is called the Bird's Head Haggadah. Very obviously why. So we don't know why they have birds' heads. We have hypotheses about why. There's two basic explanations. The first one is that there were certain communities in Germany that were very stringent at the time not to depict human forms in order to avoid what's called a graven image, which is the second of the Ten Commandments. You can't basically create a sculpted image or any representation of nature or humans and things like that. The thing is that we don't know if that's for sure the reason why the artist drew it this way. This is just our best guess. And the problem is also that in this very illustration I'm showing you now, on the other side of it, you have Pharaoh chasing after them with his army. Pharaoh is drawn without a bird's head. So if the reason is scared to represent human forms, it's not very consistent because there are human forms. There's also other Ashkenazi manuscripts from the same time that have human forms. The Sephardic manuscripts I just showed you from Spain have human forms from the same time. So the artist may have been trying to avoid this prohibition, but we don't know, and it's not 100% certain. The other explanation, which I personally resonates with me a lot better, is that the artist is trying to basically use engagement strategy. So we mentioned before about intrigue, about doing all these strange rituals, getting the kids to ask, giving out nuts at the seder, the 4 questions. What we're really trying to do is get people interested into the story. And so this is why we have illustrations to begin with, and the artist takes it a step further and draws them in a surrealist, fantastical style that you don't normally see, humans with birds' heads. And that's like, wait, what's going on here? And it keeps you looking at it. It keeps people engaged while looking at the seder. And that you can see in a lot of Haggadahs where they draw very fantastical creatures like this one. This one is also Spanish from the 1300s. There's like a random bird here. There's like a dog coming out of a bird's leg.
Oh,
There's
wow.
a human with a bird body. This Haggadah in particular has birds with human heads. The Prado Haggadah from Spain. It's using these bright colors, the gold, the very beautiful illumination. All of it is there to attract your attention and keep it on the Haggadah because, as we said, it's a very long stretch from this point until we actually eat and can relax.
What else happens during Maggid? You ask the 4 questions, which traditionally the children ask in various languages. And you tell the story of leaving Egypt, which we have seen illustrated in various ways. You want to show us other illustrations of this story, or you want to talk about different parts of Maggid?
I'll just show you a little bit more about the bird's head Haggadah. You could also see how they're baking matzah, but it's not in Egypt. This is in Germany at the time. And you could see how the women have the head coverings, the men have their own hats, and they're preparing matzah. I'll just show you this other Haggadah that I started with, which is the Washington Haggadah. So this is from the Renaissance in the late 1400s. It's called the Washington Haggadah because it's in the Library of Congress, is who owns the original, so it's named after the city. And this is on the opening page, and you can see, if you look all the way on the right, you see the list, and those are the steps that we were talking about. Here, they're just written as a few lines. But on the left, you see a man searching his house for leavened product, for chametz. And on the other side of this page, there's also a man burning it in a fire, and he's using these bellows in order to keep the fire going. And throughout it, we also see, like I showed you, the man pouring wine when it's time for the wine. This Haggadah loves to do that. Like when it's time to drink the wine, it shows a man in Italy in the late 1400s with a big goblet about to drink it. A few pages before it's time for the meal, it shows a few women roasting meat over a fire, showing how like the preparations for the food are underway, and we're about to get into the food part. But another really interesting element that appears, I don't know if it's for the first time, but one of the earliest examples are, let's call them images of redemption or messianic images. And that's because, as we mentioned, the Haggadah isn't just about the story of Exodus itself, but it kind of takes the story of the Exodus and it stretches it to every generation, including our own generation for each one, no matter what time we're in. And so this Haggadah, made in 1478, you could see there's this verse that says, Mid hametzar karasi ya anani b'merchav ya, which means, from the constraint I've called to God, and he answered me with expansion. But what's unique is that the word metzar shares the same root with the word Egypt in Hebrew, Mitzrayim, which means that Egypt is not just a place, it's a concept. And that, like we're saying, the same way they were redeemed in Egypt, we can also be redeemed. And again, it's showing a very literal depiction of what Meitzar is. It's not Egypt, but it's a Germanic castle with a man trapped in it. So he's constrained to the castle. And possibly this is referring to King David or whoever wrote the psalm. On another page, we see the image of Messiah coming into a very similar Germanic city, riding on the donkey, which again, despite what you may believe religiously, what the meaning of it, the symbolism behind this visual is of redemption in our times, not just Egypt, but extending that to today.
It's interesting. I have a couple of thoughts. First of all, one of the interesting things, one thing I want to point out, Minametza Crucia, I guess you're supposed to say, is a very beautiful song. At some point in Magid, once you get past a lot of drag, you start to sing songs, and that gets a lot nice. Like the time goes by more pleasantly, if you will. One of the interesting things that I saw in the illustrations is the man who is conducting the seder is not wearing a white kittel. Is the white kittel an Ashkenazi like contemporary visual?
I actually don't know. Wow, I don't know anything about that.
I did feel like whatever he was wearing was a better idea if you're going to drink 4 cups of wine.
That's very true.
It looked nice. Isn't that pretty? Red tights, red hat.
That's interesting. I wonder if this is just the illustration and he didn't just want to do a white shirt or like a white coat because it would just be prettier to do a darker color, or if this is based on reality. And I'm not really sure where that custom comes from. Today, like my family, I'm sure your family, the father who leads the seder wears like a white coat or like a robe to symbolize the reverence that we have for the seder. Like this is a big deal, and also add to the level of intrigue, the symbolism, the drama of this whole dinner.
I really like the illustrations on this one. Mashiach arriving, it looks very different from like the messianic element is how you call it. Mashiach, who's arriving on the donkey. This is a big part of the Passover night, I think, a theme, the idea of redemption that is brought by this mystical, sagely man. And it's such a big part of it because it's a night that Eliyahu Navi visits. He is like, I think, the incarnate of Mashiach. Is he? I don't even know what the traditions around him are.
Eliyahu Navi, you could see in this image from the Venice Haggadah, which we talked about pioneered the steps of the Seder. It also took this image of Messiah and ran with it. So all the way on the bottom left, you could see, again, the same image of Messiah on the donkey, but in front of him is what you're saying, Eliyahu Hanavi, or Elijah the prophet. He's supposed to announce the arrival of the Messiah, and you can see he's blowing a horn or a shofar. He's passing in front of a city, which is labeled at the bottom as Yerushalayim, Jerusalem. And you'll notice in the center of it is actually the Dome of the Rock, which is a stand-in for the temple, because before the modern period, there wasn't really a lot of depictions of what the temple, like we think of the Beis Hamikdash as Herod's temple, what that would have looked like. That again is also a more modern innovation where in Haggadahs from 1900s and the 2000s will have more of like an image in line with what we think of traditionally. But back then, especially after the Age of Crusaders, where that visual made its way over to Europe, a lot of Haggadahs, especially in Venice, would use the Dome of the Rock to depict the Beis HaMikdash. But to your point about Eliyahu Hanavi, yeah, he also goes part and parcel with this messianic image.
This one looks a lot more like what we were exposed to, like the one that you're showing us now, the Venice Haggadah. Like that's very familiar to me.
There's a similar moment in a Haggadah also from the 1560s called the Mantua Haggadah, also from Italy, so very similar time and place to this. And it has also an image of man on the donkey, Messiah, next to Elijah the prophet blowing the horn, the shofar. And on top of it, it says the word shveich, which is this moment where you're supposed to open the door and let Elijah in to your home. And you actually pour a whole goblet of wine that nobody drinks from.
Well, he drinks from it.
I don't know about you, but would always like look at the top. You're like, oh, it moved. There's a breeze.
Exactly.
Meanwhile, someone's like shoving the table. Yeah, whatever.
Did you hear the idea that if you have been good, then you see him?
Not really, no.
Sounds a little Santa Claus, doesn't it?
It's kind of like Santa Claus.
If you were good, you get. Yeah, we grew up with that. Like you really wanted to make Pesach nicely because then you'll see Elijah the prophet, you'll see Eliyahu Hanavi. And when I was a kid, I have a very like distinct memory. We'd open the door and we'd wait. Will I see him finally? And nothing. And I was always convinced my mother saw him. So I'd say, Mommy, did you see him?
Whoa.
And that was just all the proof I needed that she was seeing him. There was a lot of intrigue, but not the level that some people have. Like in my mother's childhood, the neighbor came in with a white sheet over his head when they opened the door for Elijah the prophet.
Oh my goodness.
Because it's that moment where you open the door for the whole world, like, and the door stays open for a little bit, right? We opened our front door like to the street, and we said Berchabu, Berchabu, like welcome, welcome, Elijah the prophet, with the door wide open.
It's this moment of bringing the redemption into our home, into this moment in time, not just the moments in history or the moments in the Bible, but like grounding it in our day, in our space. Yeah, it's very powerful.
Okay, what else do we have from Magid? Because I'm starting to get hungry. I'm seeing in my mind chicken soup with like egg noodles. I'm starting to feel like I'm gonna get it.
Yeah, I was gonna say matzo ball, but I guess not, right? Because that's gebrux.
That's gebrux, yeah.
That basically covers in terms of like the illustrations inside the Haggadah for the most part. I would say one of the most interesting illustrations that stuck out to me that I did not expect was how the four sons are depicted throughout history. So when I was growing up, my dad had a Haggadah that had an image very similar to this one.
Wow.
Have you ever seen this image before?
No, I have not.
Okay. So to me, I saw this and I instantly recognized it because the Haggadah he had, it's actually Hebrew and Russian. And it had like a huge hodgepodge of pictures. Like some of them were from historic manuscripts and prints, and some of them were just like from coloring books or like random photographs. But it had this image in it. So the four sons are the four kinds of people who attend the seder. The one on the right is the wise son, who asks deep, meaningful questions. The next one is the wicked son, who is against the whole idea and he must be rebutted. Like you have to disprove his claims. Then there's the simple son who asks surface level questions, and the one who doesn't ask questions at all the way on the left. And here he's depicted as a little child who can't ask yet. But what's interesting is that the wicked son has always been depicted as a soldier. And you can see here how he's depicted as a Roman soldier. This is from the Amsterdam Haggadah from the end of the 1600s, 1695. But throughout history, he's been depicted that way. I'll show you an example very early on from the Prado Haggadah, for example, has him as a soldier, but that one's from Spain in the 1300s. So he looks like a Spanish soldier. Then you have one from the Washington Haggadah, which I showed you. There he looks different. He's more Germanic, all the different Haggadahs. And then you get to something like the Maxwell House Haggadah. They did an edition called the Deluxe Edition from the early 60s, and it kind of defined the 60s and 70s and 80s of the Maxwell House Haggadah, in there they did a lot more abstract illustration. And again, you see the wise son is depicted as a scroll and the wicked son as a pair of daggers, and he's always depicted as a mortal threat. And even in the children's Haggadah I grew up with, the most striking feature about him is the fact that he has his tongue out and he's kind of like in this rebellious pose, like, I don't care what you have to say about me. Like, that's what he's conveying. But in his back pocket, he has a slingshot and he has a leash on like a ferocious dog. So again, the symbolism of him being a physical threat is constantly present. That's something that I didn't expect to find, but as I went through all these historic editions, you just see example after example after example. This has nothing to do with the words of the Haggadah itself. Like, the Haggadah doesn't say the wicked son is a threat. This is an artistic representation that has remained and been maintained over the centuries from all different countries, from all different times. And so to me, that also spoke to like the more meta element of this entire journey I went on, which is like we've been discussing the practical element of the seder, the story, the rituals, the songs, but there's also an additional level of the art itself. And that's something I did not appreciate until a few years ago, but this is a really good example of it.
It's really fascinating because it really tracks with what we stereotypically identify with Jewish values. In most cultures, a warrior is an icon of valor and virtue. It's a part of what gave birth to Zionism, which was Zionism was the rebellion against denigrating the warrior, right? So it's really interesting to see in my own childhood also the evil character was one with weapons. So like the Yetzer Hara in the Old Maid card game had a big giant weapon also in his pocket. So it's like the bad card you don't want has a weapon. Like there's so much criticism of all the atrocities that happened to Jews in Europe and that we didn't organize, and now Israel people see as like being something that we won't replicate. That helplessness that is born out of such a deep value of avoiding weaponry and violence, which I think can be seen in the idea, the illustration of the Rush Chacham in this picture, for instance, that you have. He doesn't have any weapons. For me, these illustrations reflect deep-seated cultural values, and they're not without vices and virtues, of course, and they're not without complications. For me, it makes me think, is this the representation of a very strong Jewish orientation of denigrating the fighter that's captured here?
There's definitely an element of that for sure.
Because it's funny because you see it, I hear you seeing it differently. You see it as a mortal threat. The reason he is bad is not because he has weapons per se, but because he's a threat to
That's
to the
right,
people.
because in a lot of places, especially in medieval Europe, as you were saying, Jews were incredibly oppressed from basically every aspect of their life. And one of them, like we mentioned with the Venice ghetto, where they had to live in a certain area, they had to wear certain badges identifying them as Jews, which put them as a separate class of people. And then part of that was also a restriction on owning weapons, which again was supposed to subdue them and, you know, make sure that, kind of like in the story of Egypt, like the enslavement, make sure that the Israelites don't rise up and take over. And this kind of came from a similar motivation. In order to get that right to have weapons, one had to basically renounce their Judaism and become convert to Christianity, become an apostate. And so the Haggadah says that the wicked son, kafa be'ikr, he denied the core values, meaning he is an apostate. And so how do you represent that visually? So in the children's Haggadah that I grew up with, it's represented, you know, with an expression, but that's a very recent thing. Normally it was represented with aggression. And I like what you were saying also, that it doesn't have to be for strictly historical reasons. It could also be to try to give you like a moral to the illustration, which is that you see how violence is, or aggression, or just being armed can sometimes be equated with apostasy itself.
I think ultimately Jews, because we weren't historically able to have weapons, came to associate weapons with non-Jews, and so this represents the non-Jew or not the Jew, and that also then becomes another element in the negative connotations with weaponry, even if it's for self-defense. So for good and for bad, weaponry becomes something that's seen as bad.
Exactly.
That's so much story in one historical imagery.
Now you're getting why I've obsessed about this for a number of years,
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
think I'll continue to obsess about it. And one final piece I'll add to this, very interestingly, there's a Haggadah from the late 30s called the Arthur Szyk Haggadah, and Arthur Szyk himself was from Poland, but he made it out into London, and he published this Haggadah in 1940. So while London is being bombed, he published this Haggadah, and the wicked son there is depicted. Initially, he had a swastika armband, and he eventually repainted that image and took out the swastika because he didn't want to get the book into too much controversy. You could see how the son, he's wearing German clothing, and he resembles the dictator of Germany at the time.
Oh, wow.
And again, it represents
Uh,
this idea that
that's
the wicked
wild.
son is a
That's really
threat. So
wild.
even though in that image, he's not exactly armed, but he looks very much like the ideology at the time that was posing a mortal threat.
He looks like a fighter, army officer, essentially, someone in the military to me, or maybe a noble person.
You can contrast him with what the Y son looks like on the other side, which is more like a traditionalist image, maybe a Hasidic to some extent. Like,
Yeah.
contrast that with the wicked son that's not only dressed modern, but specifically aligned with a very anti-Jewish ideology. I'm actually curious, did you have was there a particular edition on the Haggadah that you grew up with that kind of represents your childhood experience at the Seder?
Oh, I have to say, I'm super embarrassed that once I got into this interview, I was like, I should have looked for a Hasidic Haggadah first. I do believe I might have some because I do tend to collect stuff. I just want to show you because it's really interesting what you're saying about the illustration of the Haggadah, like in Spain, as Spanish people dressed, because this is how I grew up. This is a particularly interesting to me children's book on the story of Exodus. You can see here the Jews are enslaved, and you can see also that they look like the people of today. And like you said, the idea of archaeologically informed illustrations is a very modern view of history, of time. This is how I find this really an interesting complement to what you have shown us. This is the story with the hands up, see? And they're
Wow.
leaving, see?
That is crazy. I just got chills. That's
Yeah.
amazing. Wow.
Yeah, this really complements the story.
Wow.
What I love about what you're showing me is that it's so easy for contemporary people to see how the Hasidic community tells stories and be dismissive and be like, oh, they're so backwards. But the truth is, if you look at it with the eyes of how history has evolved and how people have usually made sense and made meaning, it totally makes sense. And it's like a beautiful part of like the way you learned it, the way I learned it, all of these visuals together make up so many different perspectives that are captured.
I'm glad you went and found that. That was really cool.
So wow, this is incredibly fun. So what happens after, so essentially you're reciting these verses and looking at these images in the Seder, and you start with Manishtana, the questions, and you go on to reciting the story and the memories. We were in Egypt. Magid ends with Hallel, with praising God in beautiful song.
Yes. We get to the end of the story, and then we get to the redemption, and then we get to Hallel, which is saying some psalms, or singing, I should say, psalms, in thanks to God for the redemption. And then comes more symbolic foods. So this is where we actually eat the matzah. First, we wash our hands again. We eat the matzah. We eat the bitter herbs. People like to add charoses, which is kind of like a apple and wine jam fruit salad type concoction. It's supposed to take away from the bitterness of the horseradish, but it also represents the mortar. The Israelites were building cities for the Egyptians, and so the charoses, this jam, represents the mortar used to build those cities. And then finally you get to the meal, like you said, chicken soup, whatever, the main course. And then it ends off with eating more matzah called afikomen. And this is where we kind of take a turn into the symbolic element of redemption, particularly grounding it in nowadays. So we have the grace after meals, which is the next step. In that, we also have certain passages that talk about harachamani zakenu, limais hamashiach, like we should make it to the days of Messiah. We then have the opening of the door for Elijah. You have more psalms, which include the one, like we said, about constraint and expansion. And then you finally get to Nirtza, which is the ending of the Seder itself. And it opens with the statement that next year in Jerusalem. So it's kind of like the culmination of the redemptive stage of the Seder. And then that final piece includes a lot of songs and poems that come out of the Middle Ages in Europe, particularly from the world of Ashkenaz. One that everyone's familiar with is, of course, Haggadah, which is the one little goat. It's like this whole chain of events, and it's like the Jewish version of the little old lady who swallowed the fly, and it just keeps going and going until God has to come down and say, guys, cut this out. It's enough. Time to go to shluff.
Haggadah, Haggadah. And I think as a result, when you say Haggadah, it's come to be associated with like, all right, it's enough, right? Yeah, we're done. It's interesting what's visually important to the Haggadah and what's emotionally important in the order of the night. For instance, one of the most famous parts of the Seder is the Afikomen, which you mentioned, which is you break a matzah and you hide a half of it and the children steal it, and then you bargain with them to get it back, and you say, what can I do to get it back? The children will make a line of, like, that's how it was at my father's table. They stand there in line, and one by one they say, we'll give it back if you give me a new bike, if you give me a new pocketbook or backpack. And then my father would say, I don't know, that's totally unfair, that's like too much. And then after a period of bargaining, he said, fine, and you'd give back the matzah. The afikomen was like the highlight for children, and really the purpose of the afikomen, it comes after Magid, is to get the children intrigued enough to stay until the end. But I don't think that has an important role in the visual illustrations of the Haggadah.
I don't think that's really illustrated anywhere, honestly. Yeah, and I think you're right that it's about keeping the intrigue. And like, if you can make it to the end, you'll basically earn a prize.
It's really interesting the way the night has these different pieces and these different elements. And by the end, when you get to Haggadah, like children are sleeping under the table, they're sleeping in bed, everyone is tired, and you're going through these long, there's a lot of reciting. The whole night there's a lot of reciting. In our seders, we would end the seder. Whoever was still awake would say the last chant, which was Nirtza. Nirtza, vesetiti alle Sachen, is bavilik bei der Eibishter. Nirtza, whoever does all these things is like in God's good graces. So yeah, it's like a nice like epilogue, like final sentence. The most beautiful part of the ending of the Seder is really singing Lashana Haba, may we be redeemed next year, because it ends on such an uplifting note. Yes, we remember our suffering, and yes, we remember the past and enslavement, but if you make it through a long night of being hungry and all these rituals, then we're feeling good and looking up. I like that. Well, thank you so much, David. I really enjoyed talking to you about this.
Absolutely.
I'm looking forward to watching your movie. I did get, luckily, a sneak peek. It was very beautiful.
Yeah, thank you.
It's very beautiful. It's very clear you put a lot into it, a lot of heart and time. When's it coming out?
Hopefully it should already be out when people are seeing this. You can go check it out on my channel, Yiddishkeit, or @_Yiddishkeit. It's up there. You can go check it out. In the film, it's broken into 6 sections where I go to 6 different locations together with my friend Mayor Chamowitz, and we film all of these moments of the Haggadah up close. So we get manuscripts from Spain, Germany, the Renaissance. Then we go to the printing age, Gutenberg, Venice, Prague, Amsterdam. And then we get to the modern age, we get to Maxwell House. So we go to Hoboken, which is where Maxwell House used to have a coffee factory, which is where the Maxwell House Haggadah first started. And then we wrap everything up at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. We actually look at some Egyptian artifacts, and we see how like modern Haggadahs are inspired by archaeology, but still maintaining the themes of the illustrations that go back to all the Haggadahs throughout history.
Wow, very beautiful. we're going schluffing already, David. So we're gonna leave it for people to watch it on your channel.
Fantastic.
I really appreciate you chatting with me, and also I want to thank all the viewers and the podcast listeners as well. Thank you, and good night.